So yesterday I had to go get my car inspected, and I was at the auto shop, and the car mechanic there was talking to me, and she said, "I really like what you've done with your eyebrow." So I ran in my car and looked in the mirror, and there's this bit of white grayness in this part of the edge of my eyebrow. It's just the hair just turned white or gray seemingly overnight. Like, I would have noticed this on Friday. I kind of started thinking, whoa, is this like my hair starting to turn gray? Is this a common thing? Do people's eyebrows turn first? I have no idea. I haven't actually looked into it. But I was like, wow, my hair might become a sea of gray unless it falls out first. I was like, a sea of gray is kind of a metaphor, right? So that's what we're going to talk about today, metaphors. Now it is a very rainy Sunday, and maybe I should be writing, but honestly I just feel like reading and talking about metaphors. Whenever I feel guilty for reading too much instead of writing, I just have to remind myself that input is just as important as output sometimes, so you need to do both. When I'm reading, I don't go searching for metaphors, but when I stumble upon them, my eyes light up. So first off, what is a metaphor? Well, let's look at the dictionary definition. So the world of metaphors is massive. There's so much to talk about. There's so many areas to touch on. There's great metaphors, but there's also dead metaphors and cliches. As an example, I have a difficult time grasping challenging concepts. We use that so often, we don't even think of it as a metaphor. Another one would be, that film had a really big impact on me. So these are sometimes called dead metaphors. I could spend more time talking about these, but I just don't have time to do that. This video would go on too long, and there's so many other areas within the family or category of metaphor that I could talk about, because, you know, it's not just metaphors in this group or this family, but it's also similes, allegories, analogies. So I'm just going to focus on 4 aspects of metaphor today. So the first one is, why do I like metaphors? And really the easiest answer is that I just think they're really fun and they're really interesting. They're fun to come up with yourself, and they're exciting. They're also really enjoyable to stumble upon, to find a metaphor in a book and your eyes light up. And that's a kind of magical experience when you come across a metaphor that you've never encountered before. So metaphors are just enjoyable in and of themselves. So number 2 is that metaphors clarify, they persuade, and they induce awe. So first off, how do metaphors clarify? Well, when we're reading, for example, and there is a big event that happens, a big action scene, and sometimes it's hard to visualize exactly what it is. In film, it's different because film, you know, you just get to see it. But when you're reading, sometimes the writer has to turn to metaphor to create the image, to make the image come alive. A great example is in Marilynne Robinson's novel Housekeeping. A key event early on is a train wreck. A train is going along the track and it crashes into the water. Now, this isn't a really challenging image to visualize, but it helps to have a really good metaphor to really make that come to life in the text. And Robinson does just that. Now, she actually does it in the form of a simile, but similes are very close to metaphors. I mean, they're definitely like in the same family, like they're very close-knit siblings, I would say. So in the book, Robinson writes, "The train, which was black and sleek and elegant, and was called the Fireball, had pulled more than halfway across the bridge when the engine nosed over toward the lake, and then the rest of the train slid after it into the water. like a weasel sliding off a rock. So the weasel sliding off the rock is just a stroke of genius. It blew me away when I read it. I was like, that is perfect. That completely brings the image full circle. I totally can now see this. It's so phenomenal. So that's how metaphors, or in this case simile, do clarify in literature. Now, the second thing is that metaphors persuade. This can be much more useful in law. So let's say you've got a case where there was a mob that went after and attacked an innocent bystander. Now in court, a good attorney might rely on a metaphor to persuade a jury. So they might refer to the mob as a swarm of bees ready to sting. That can really help to convince the jury when simply talking about the literal action might not. So the metaphor serves here to just accentuate the literal action and can be a really useful tool for a lawyer in a court to persuade someone. Now, if it's not a court, you can still use them to persuade in real life too. It's just humans seem to have this really innate ability to understand metaphor. We're just really good at it. I'm actually not entirely sure if it's innate or if we're just so used to metaphors that we just do really well with them because we've encountered them from such an early age, because they're constantly showing up in the things we read. And so I think whether it's innate or whether it's something we're just so accustomed to that it feels innate, and it's probably a mix of both. Bottom line is we do really well with metaphors, so they become really useful when you want to convince somebody of something. So metaphors are a great tool of persuasion. Finally, metaphors induce awe. This is my favorite form of metaphor, where it's not serving a practical purpose. It's simply there to blow your mind, to bring you to this sense of utter beauty and awe, and where you're simply floored. And I'm at a loss for words almost, because it's that feeling that is almost indescribable, but you know what it is when something takes your breath away. My favorite example might be Ezra Pound's Imagist poem, In a Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Now, I'm not going to dig deep into that poem or that metaphor. Either you kind of get it or you don't, I feel like. For me, it's just, from the first time I read it, it just completely worked. And I almost don't want to talk about it, because the sense of awe I have is almost beyond words. And it's a metaphor that, well, I guess you could say it almost transcends analysis. It's this powerful feeling that it creates inside, and that's enough. All right, so number 3 is that metaphors can be used to express the inexpressible. So this is best used, I would say, in science fiction or any type of really imaginative story. Those are typically most effective when they're metaphors for something in real life. So oftentimes there are things in life that are just so difficult and challenging to talk about literally that we have to turn to a story and use the entire story as a metaphor for that thing. And so that is the third use of metaphor, that it touches on things that are really difficult to talk about or not even possible to talk about. And so the only way we can attempt to do it is by telling a story, and the entire story is a representation or a metaphor for that really challenging concept or idea or event or notion. Any of those things. That is the third use of metaphor, and I could give a ton of examples of great science fiction novels, or fantasy stories typically do this really well too, but I think you kind of get where I'm going at with this idea, so I'm not going to dwell on it too long. I actually want to get to the fourth and final point, and that is that metaphors are like transactions. So a writer gives you a metaphor, and you read the metaphor, you understand the metaphor, because again, we have a really good understanding of metaphors and we grasp them really well. And once we grasp the metaphor, we accept it, and that transaction is then complete. Now, the most baffling and sort of radical example of what this actually means is when a storyteller gives us a character. Now, the character themselves are not the metaphor. It is our ability as a reader to identify with the character that creates the metaphor. So that's a little bit of a complicated and maybe a challenging idea. So let me clarify it a little bit. I'm reading a book called The Nearest Thing to Life, and I've actually got the book right here, The Nearest Thing to Life. James Wood is just an incredible critic, and if you want to read something that isn't really dry and academic and just puts you to sleep, I mean, definitely check him out. It's incredible. And this book is sort of a memoir / analysis of literature and why we read and the power of reading. And if you're feeling like you don't quite have the drive to read great literature, this book will definitely get you back in the zone and make you want to read every great book that was ever written, because Wood just writes really passionately and convincingly about classic literature, and his prose is so clean and easy to read, but the ideas are incredibly compelling and concise. So I would highly encourage you to read the book, and it's very short. It's probably a little over 100 pages, so you could read it in just a weekend. But in one section of the book, Wood actually does talk about metaphor. So he writes, metaphor is a form of identification. To identify with a fictional character is a kind of identification, and thus a metaphorical leap. So let me unpack this just a little bit. So to identify is to empathize. To empathize is to participate, right? Because to really empathize, to really understand someone, you can't just watch them from afar and say, oh, I think I kind of understand you. That's not real empathy, is it? I think it has to be something more. So there has to be this participation. What is participation? Well, typically that's going to be when we talk about, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. That's when you really can be, empathetic. That's when you really can come to understand the plight and suffering of another person. When you put yourself in someone else's shoes, that is a metaphorical transaction. Now, how is that a metaphor? When you say, put yourself in Hamlet's shoes, you are doing that because you are trying to understand Hamlet, to see the world as he sees it, and you will experience empathy and compassion for him by doing so. By saying, I am in Hamlet's shoes, you are essentially saying, I am Hamlet. When you say, I am Hamlet, that's a metaphor. Now, when you say, I have a sea of knowledge about something, that's cool. It's cool to identify your knowledge with the sea, but to identify yourself with another human being, it's beyond cool. It's this kind of radical, galvanizing form of empathy. And in literature, we are constantly identifying with other characters. We are so used to it that we don't think of it as metaphor, but when you really break it down, I think it is metaphor. It's in the same family. And we're so used to metaphors, we've practiced them so much with these really easy examples, that when it comes time to these challenging metaphors of identification with other people, they just happen and they work. But without that initial practice of just constantly encountering metaphors, you have to ask yourself, would we actually identify with Hamlet? It's a big question. I don't think there's an answer, but it's something to think about, and it makes you realize that metaphors are much more complex than we realize, and there's much more to say, and there's things we don't even know about them, but someday we might, and that to me is incredibly exciting. Also, if you're writing, make sure to practice metaphors. Put them in your work. You know, you can always remove them from your stories if they kind of suck. But if you come up with one, just throw it in there. And, you know, if you need to take it out, you can also use it for something later. So it actually helps to have a journal of metaphors too. Anytime you come up with one, just write it down. You never know when you're going to use it. But anyway, that's all I've got today. I'm going to go and just enjoy the rain. I don't know if you can hear it in the background, but it is just raining like crazy still. So I'm going to go read some more and enjoy the sound of the rain, and that's going to be the rest of my day. So thanks so much for watching. Please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done that yet. And that's all I've got. So enjoy your Sunday, and we'll see you next time.